Wonderful. And we'd love it if you could be interactive. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat. We'd love to see you in person if you feel comfortable. So feel free to come online when you are answering questions, because you're going to be doing the majority of the speaking and sharing your stories today. So with that said, let me go ahead and move over to the agenda so you can have a sense of what we're going to be spending our time doing. We're going to be talking about the purpose of the project, and Jennifer Chenoweth, who many of you may know, with Oakwood Chapel Cemetery, she's going to be going over a summary of this project. You're going to have an opportunity to meet the project team. You may know many of them today, but you're going to have an opportunity to hear about their roles and meet the project team. And then the majority of the time we're going to be spending with you, and you're going to be sharing stories and insights as we have a couple of prompts and questions. This is a small group discussion. We are coming to you as the experts here and giving us advice on how we should move this project forward, and then sharing your lived experience about what you believe we should be capturing in this project. And then we'll just close off with next steps. There's some opportunities, and some of you may already taken part in some of the discussions, the oral history stories that we've been running one-on-one. Jennifer's going to be going over some of that, and then I'll be sharing just a couple of housekeeping rules. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Laura. So first let me introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Chenoweth, and I manage the space at the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel. We're part of the Museums and Cultural Programs Division of within the Parks and Recreation Department for the City of Austin. The chapel sits within this segregated section of the cemetery in Oakwood Cemetery, and we've just opened as a visitor center to the public in spring of 2019. So we weren't even open a full year before we had to close for COVID, but that's allowed us to get a lot of research done. So one of the things we do is talk to descendants who come to visit their ancestors at the cemetery, and we help them find their graves. And we also interpret the lives of the 23,000 people buried here within that 40-acre area. So the image you're looking at on the screen is a bird's eye view drawing of Austin in 1873. And the people buried in the segregated section of the cemetery were buried here roughly between 1850 and 1900. Some burials happened later, but usually because the family member knew that they had a family lot or area designated. But most of the thousands of burials within the segregated section, which is about 3 acres, are in unmarked graves. We've done everything we can do so far and are looking for ways to further identify the people that are buried here. We don't know the location of their particular graves. Greg Farrar, who you'll meet shortly, has done a lot of research into the burial lists. We've done a monument survey. But one of the reasons I like this 1873 map is that's kind of right in the middle of that 50 years of Austin's early growth. The old Capitol is the biggish building kind of in the middle of that. That building burned and was later replaced by the newer Capitol in the 1880s. The north end street you would see on that map is what would be Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard today, which is the northern boundary of the blue section, which is an approximation of the 40 acres that the cemetery has expanded to now. The red area is what the acreage of the cemetery was in 1873. So it really grew as the city grew over time. What we want to do is learn everything we can about the people buried there and see how and where their lives occurred in Austin and geolocate their lives and their legacies back into the history of Austin. So the purpose of the project is accountability for the lives of the people buried here, which in their time, their whole names may not have been even recorded in the book. And we know that many of their grave locations were unrecorded. We would also like to create a digital model of the cemetery as if we knew where they were buried, so that you can imagine the space as if they could have afforded headstones for the people buried there. This is an aerial view of a 3D model. This one was taken from Google Earth. So this is what a 3D model looks like. It's satellite imagery, drone imagery, street photography, up close detailed photography, all patched together to be an interactive model. We've done a drone flyover of this area. We have created an initial 3D model. We're working on a database of information about all of the people that we can collect to be shared there. And we're looking for your information as descendants, organizational representatives, community members, of what really needs to be included in this project to hold real accountability for these people and Austin's history. So would you like me to go ahead and introduce the other people next? All right, so I'm gonna next introduce Dr. Maria Franklin. She is an archaeologist and anthropologist, and she consulted with our project for the All Together Here project about the fact that the chapel itself was built on top of graves. We have since reburied those people and held a small memorial, and are planning on how we interpret and memorialize those burials. But I learned a deep respect for Dr. Maria Franklin and her real passion for understanding the lives of the people in places. And so I'm really honored that we get to work with her as part of this team and have her expert point of view as an archaeologist in Texas history. Dr. Tara Dudley is a historic preservationist, and she teaches at the University of Texas School of Architecture. I forgot to mention Dr. Franklin also is a professor at the University of Texas. And I met Dr. Dudley because she came to the cemetery looking for a monument of a stonemason, an African-American stonemason who's buried here. And she stopped in the chapel and we got to visiting, and I have been looking forward to working with her on a project of how we think about the material interpretation of place and the people who built Austin, who she's also done substantial research on. Diana Hernandez is here. She is a graduate student working on her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin with Dr. Dudley in the University of Texas School of Architecture. And I made her acquaintance as she was presenting several community symposium on remembrance of people of color, which she's done over the past 2 years. And she's working on her thesis and dissertation research on Mexican-American cemeteries. Dr. Lara Cortez is our communications person, and she's fabulous, and she's making sure my big ideas are communicated well about this project and helping manage really the conversations with you all. We are very aware that the city of Austin has not always earned the community's trust in preserving history of people. And we want to make sure that she does a better job of communicating than I might in all the many things I do, and make sure you are all heard and followed up with, and that you feel like you have an advocate for this project for us. I'm going to also introduce Greg Farrar. He works for us at the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel part-time. I also met him when he came to the cemetery with his family to visit his ancestors. His great-great-grandfather, Reuben Shannon Lovingood, is buried here, and his great-great-grandfather was a huge influence on on African-American history in our country. He was a classicist and was the first president of Samuel Houston College. So it's a real honor to get to work with him to research the descendants buried, the ancestors buried here, and to have him as a representative descendant on our staff team. Caitlin Hill is the project manager at the Cemetery Operations Division of Parks and Recreation Department. And she is my colleague in trying to understand the records and what we can do in this place and engaging the community about the history of the people buried here. Did I miss anything, Laura?
Great job, Jennifer. Thank you for that introduction. I also want to give an opportunity to the project team if they want to say a little something to the audiences before we get started, or something about themselves that they'd like to share. And that includes Greg and Caitlin before we jump into storytelling. So I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes.
Sure. I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Craig.
I just want to say, you know, I'm definitely grateful just to be able to help out in any way that I can and just be a part of this initiative. So happy to be here.
I just want to say thank you for folks who showed up from the community to take time out of their days to provide some insight, perspective, and to share their not only their expertise, but also their wisdom on, you know, having engaged with different kinds of histories, historic preservation around cemeteries, and lending those insights to us. So thank you for coming. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, I'll just echo Dr. Franklin's gratitude. We really appreciate your input and your being a significant and instrumental part of this conversation. So thanks for being here today.
I'm gonna jump on the gratitude train and also thank you all for being here. The records, when we can find the information, only tell a small part of the story. So whatever we can do to incorporate the actual stories of the people, absolutely beyond grateful for that.
So with that, we're going to do a turnover to the audience members that are here. And we're going to kind of do a little small icebreaker before we get into the questions. Everybody loves a little bit of icebreakers. You can share as much as you want or as little as you like. But for those of you that are joining us as guests to this small group discussion, we'd love for you to share your name. We've had a little small conversation, but your name, your affiliation to the cemetery. Today you're attending as a community organization, but you may be in a dual role, or you may have worked with the cemetery prior to that. And then just sharing what you hope to learn today. Give us some insights to what you might want to be doing and what you want to learn. So either of you, we have 4 of you today attending as participants. We'll turn it over to you. And if you want to share your name, your affiliation today, or your organization's name, and then what you hope to learn today.
Greetings, my name is Kimberly Keaton. I am an art librarian. I am the former African-American community archivist and librarian somewhere in Austin. I'm a PhD student at the University of North Texas, Mean Green. I have no idea anything about UT, but hello, people. And my affiliation would be, I'm African-American. I have descendants from the state of Texas, Austin, everywhere in the state of Texas. What do I want to learn? I'm a lifelong learner. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Miss Stephanie, hi.
Hi, everybody.
Perfect timing, Stephanie. We're just having a community members introduce themselves. And
Okay.
so thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Did I need to go? Oh,
No,
Oh,
you
okay.
can if you want to. Your mic is on. It's up to you.
no, I'll take a moment.
Okay. Okay, Miss Stephanie.
Okay, I'm Bernadette Pfeiffer, and I am the former director curator of the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center. And when I saw the initial email, I was more than elated to see that this is on a great path. And learning about the various celebrants at the cemetery has been a long challenge. When I was curator and director at the Carver, we often had people come and want to know about persons who were at the cemetery. And I remember, well, two distinct travels to the cemetery, which is just basically a block up from the museum. And one was disappointing in that we couldn't find Mahalia Murchison. And it was very disheartening. And but the yearning for her and others was still there. The other was the Yearwoods. And knowing that Dr. Connie Yearwood Connor was one of our founding members, and to have the linkage of her family there was, and still is, in my view, very important. And I'm just delighted to be able to be here and serve in what limited capacity I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.
Mm-hmm.
Melissa or Dr. Smith? Thank you.
I'm Melissa Rogers. I'm the president of Save Austin Cemeteries, have been for the past 3 years. So I sort of hit COVID right when everyone else did, when we were just sort of starting, or I was just sort of starting out in this role. I think for Save Austin Cemeteries, prior to Aro and I getting involved, the focus had been kind of on Oakwood and telling the stories of the sort of famous people at Oakwood. And I think what we have been hoping to do as an organization is expand what we're doing and the stories that we're telling and the people that are being represented in those stories to be more inclusive. So we are excited about this project. I think it will be great. There is so much history of the ordinary people of Austin that are the people who really built this city and built our community. And we're hoping to just see that represented more.
Thank you. And thank you for being here, Melissa.
I'm Aro. I wear two hats. I came to Oakwood Cemetery researching the Oddfellows plot. The Independent Order of Oddfellows has a plot with 16 spots or 14 spots. Anyway, which is at the edge of the area that we're talking about. I came to Oakwood looking for where our graves were as an organization. And that's how I got involved with Save Austin Cemeteries. So I am the secretary of Save Austin Cemeteries. I'm also the secretary of the Capitol Lodge 23 Independent Order of Oddfellows. Both of these organizations are dedicated to preserving cemeteries and our history. And that's what I would like to see here. When people look at this empty piece of land next to the cemetery, next to the chapel, they assume it's empty. And what I would like to be able to do is tell the story of the 2,300 souls buried there that were the pioneers of Austin, the people that did the real work. They were not the heroes, but they did the real work of building our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Aro. Thank you for being here. And Miss Stephanie, that would leave you.
All right. Well, you definitely have the dream team of folks here. It's really great to see everybody. I'm Stephanie Lang, and I also wear two hats. I think that brings me to this moment, which is the first one is Director of Equity and Community Advocacy for the Center for Community Engagement, really working to leverage resources of the university with engaged community. And a big part of what we do and what kind of brought me to this role is work around preservation and storytelling. And then I'm also the founder of Reclaim, which is an organization that really works to uncover, recover, spotlight the histories and stories of Black people throughout the diaspora. And right now, the focus is definitely on Austin. So I'm just really excited to be a part of these conversations. I have been able to witness all the amazing work that Jennifer and Greg and Caitlin, all of the team has done. And I mean, I just echo all the sentiments around, like, yes, we have a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of folks that need to be honored and recognized, and I'm here to do whatever I can to support those efforts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here too. So with that, just in sharing what you are hoping to learn, we wanted to put some context around what we were hoping to also hear from you, or just provide some general context on the questions. So Jennifer, we sat down and there's so much we could ask. There's so many things, but we know we have such a short, finite period of time. So we wanted to provide a little bit of context. And so when we met with her, she started brainstorming, and I was writing down notes, and I said, this is great. We want to know the how and the what we're going to do this, and how we're going to capture this information so this project continues beyond this time. But she said something that was really powerful. And so I wanted to share this with you and how we can frame our conversation for today. And she said, if we fast forward 100 years from now, how do we, or do you believe this story should be told? So capturing this for generations. And if you're here as a descendant, how would you want your family to learn about your ancestors? So the how, we're going to be talking about the how first. And then we're going to start thinking about the context. What information should be contained in these stories? That's the important thing, that when you go years from now and you're saying, I wish they would have asked this question, or wish this information would have been contained. So we're going to ask you the question about about what information. And then the lens. It may be multiple lenses that we decide, but from your standpoint and from where you're coming from, what lens should the stories be told? Should that be through neighborhood based? Should that be through the context of the city and the cemetery? Or should that be through the actual people who we're trying to honor through this project? So this is the context. This is just to give you a little bit about the questions we're going to ask. So we're going to dive first into the how. And the way we want this conversation to go is we're really going to go on mute and be here to hear. So if you want to chime off of each other, or you want to add, or you want to move, this is going to be a very open space for conversation. So as we move along, I might move on to the next question, but there's really 3 today. And so the first thing that we're going to begin with is the how. How should we tell the story of the historic colored grounds of Oakwood Cemetery? How should we be doing this? So that is the first question we are going to open it up to. And I'm going to go ahead and go on mute and allow you guys to begin the discussion.
I have one question before we get into this discussion. So are we talking about the people who that you don't have names for, correct? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the ones who have names. Or have you not told the story at all?
They will all be represented.
Okay. So I have a question for Dr. Maria Franklin. Is that her last name? Okay. Are you around, Dr. Franklin?
Am I around? I'm here in Austin. Ma'am.
My question being that when I came in summer 2018, as an archivist, as a librarian, what I was told to do was to tell the story of East Austin, of Black people who are no longer here. So as an archaeologist and looking at a burial ground and thinking about our ancestors, your ancestors, my ancestors, who don't have names, how do you tell that story as an archaeologist? How do you do that?
Well, as an archaeologist, we would look at the burial practices. We would look at the communities that these folks were attached to. So for example, in 2002, there were, there's a Freedman Cemetery in Dallas. And my students and I, because the Texas Department of Transportation did this massive reburial because they built an expressway through and they needed to move the burials. And so like over 1,100 bodies were removed. And we wanted to tell the story, we wanted to study the living communities. Like, what were their lives like? Where did these folks come from? And so me and a couple of my graduate students did a summer of field work with the historically Black church, St. Paul United Methodist Church in Dallas. And we dug on their on land that they had right next to the church to study, something about the late 19th century Black experience there. So that's one way in which to get at the story. And I think that is what Jennifer and the city is planning to do, is not just to look at, to compartmentalize Black folks' lives into like, this is where they died and they were buried here, right? But what were their lives like? What communities they come from, which is why there's an oral history program, why we want to talk to folks, who know about Austin history, because there are different ways to get at that, what the living community was like, right? So we take a more holistic perspective to the history that's represented at Oakwood. So as an archaeologist, that's what I'm interested in doing, right? So, yes, burial customs, the role of the church, the role of the Black undertaker, King Tier mortuary, for example. They have a long history in the Austin community. There's a number of historic Black churches. So those are folks in Black industries that are involved with, mortuary customs and so forth, and Black religion, of course, right? But again, we also need to take a more broader perspective of what were the communities that these folks were, living in, residing in, what were the social relations like, what was their life like during the time that they were living prior to passing away and being laid to rest at Oakwood. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on. I know you wanted something shorter.
No, I just wanted to get the conversation started. I thought that was a good way, but that was I had that question in my mind, like, how would you go about it before I start thinking about how I'm gonna go about it as someone who deals with, the soil, the touching it, all of these things. And that was a good reference in regards to Dallas. So thank you for that. So Stephanie, we've both worked in the communities together separately. You know more than I do about these communities. So I guess I would say, what would it look like if the community told a story?
Mm-hmm.
Versus, because we talk about that often. We're
Right.
always telling the story. But what if the community finally gets to tell the story?
Right.
That's the first thing that came into my mind, because I feel like there are always the Kimberlys, the Stephanies, the Gregs, the McGee's, all the people that we know in regards to Austin's Black history and speaking to it. Is that fair for us to just come in and say, okay, this is how you go about this, versus first thinking about community and allowing them to view this from their perspective and how they view the cemetery?
Right. Well, I will say that all the work that I try to do is always connected to what the community wants. Like, that's a big part of what we do. And the work I've done with the Reclaim, which I think works here as well, and to what Dr. Franklin was saying, is getting this information, right? Letting the geography tell these stories, letting all of this come from what is unearthed, and then presenting that to the community and saying, this is what we've discovered, and adding kind of this additional research on this, what's been uncovered, and then let the community decide, like, here are some of these stories that have come out of this, or this is some of the things that we found, what stories you think need to be told, or in what order, or, you know, what has the most kind of value or connection for you and you know, your identity, and you're a part of the community. So I think that there's ways to kind of to do all of this together. And I actually think all of this is needed together to move forward.
Have you ever told a story from
Have
this
I
point
ever?
of view, from this point of view, as it pertains to burial grounds and them? I'm looking at those who don't have names.
Right.
That's what I'm thinking about. Those who don't have names. So in your body of work, have you went that route and told a story about those individuals without names?
I think the work that you were part of with Clarksville, and the work that I know Dr. Dudley and some others I are speaking about, I think that was one way. Before we knew the names of the enslaved connected to Pease Plantation, we, you know, worked to figure out what the community wanted to know about them and what stories needed to be told. So I think that's probably the closest connection to what's happening now. But
Okay.
and real quick, I forgot to mention, I'm also representing the Travis County Historical Commission today as a member. So, yes.
I was going to jump in real fast, especially as we talk about those records where we don't have, you know, any names. Sometimes we just have a first name. Sometimes we don't have any name. What we do have is an internment date, hopefully. And so that internment date is kind of going to be the basis of the conversation of like what was going on in Austin around that time, around that year. That might have some context as to those stories. And I was going to say, like, as we talk about trying to tell a story of a community, I think we always think about community and we want to bunch it into just one thing. But a community is like a group of individual voices. And so you really have to have the perspective of as many different voices as you can, and as diverse as the community is and was. And so, because you don't want people to just, you know, generalize what early Austin was, because in reality, you might have people living in the same areas, but you have unique people that have different beliefs, do different things, are educated in different levels, in different ways. And so really trying to tell a diverse story that really captures who we're trying to kind of illuminate as far as being buried there. And so I think that's my hope in really trying to tell the full picture, the full story, and tell the truth, even if it's brutally honest, which it should be, and also try to diverse it as much as we can. So.
I have this is Bernadette, and I can agree with all of what's said. I think for me, the cemetery is a living being. And so to tell the story of those persons who know the full name, and we only know partial names of the people who are buried there, is very important. And to tell their history, even though it may have been Miss Ann who is buried there, we need to tell her story too. And it may not be as long as, and this is certainly hypothetical, Judge so-and-so who's buried there, or Dr. so-and-so who's buried there. Their contribution to the community is, and I say it in the living, because is as important as the individuals who have attained some kind of what we would call today recognition, notable recognition within the community. Those small individuals, I think, is important. as those other people.
I don't know, I kind of see it as like the Middle Passage, you know, and just, I see an image in my mind right now as they're crossing over the Atlantic Oceans, coming into these United States, and they have no names. Everything's stripped, you know, on that water, bodies of water. And when they get here, everything's taken away, and then they're given something. So how do we flip that? When you think about that, and you think about burial grounds, and you think about, and I understand what we're talking about. I mean, I get it as far as the community being diverse, but the narrative, you know, how do we start that narrative? And I think for me, just that image of the Middle Passage with everything being stripped away from us. And when you think about death and not having a name, not having that marker, not having, you know, the dates, nothing. That's how I'm viewing it right now. Hopefully I'm not confusing people. We all know history, so hopefully that makes sense to you where I'm going with that.
It makes absolute sense, because to me as an archaeologist, the absence of evidence is telling a story as well, right? So what I am hearing from you, Ms. Keaton, and from Ms. Pfeiffer, when she talks about being disappointed and disheartened on that visit to the cemetery, trying to find someone who is not located, who can't be located, right? Is like, is that, so I just want to be sure, because we want to know what you want to see. Is that part of that narrative that needs to be told, that, 100 years from now, people need to know that people were completely erased. They were buried and then built on top of. Their markers were never replaced, because they were probably wooden markers or what have, they were forgotten, right? And that is very much, as you're saying, linked to that Middle Passage, right? That racial terror. And this was one way. We want to tell other kinds of narratives. I'm not saying that this should be the only one, but is this part of the story that we need to be telling? This is what I'm hearing anyway, but I'm posing it as a question.
For
Do
myself,
we want to tell that story?
For myself, I would say yes, being a resident of the state capitol for 3 years, and that's all I've seen is erasure, but the story being told by others. So, yes, I think the truth needs to be told, what you just said, buried on top. So where are they? Where are they in this whole narrative of the cemetery, period?
Yeah, I believe that no matter what, and I think that this project has to speak truth. And whether it is that buried upon top of one another, or whether it is the celebration of one individual, it has to be the truth, whether this person was, say, famous or infamous. We have to tell the truth.
Right. I totally agree. And it keeps coming into my mind is one of the more recent times that I've been to Oakwood was for a tour of where, like, the servant girl murders, where these folks were buried, right? So they're just like, somewhere in this area. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that is an entree into, if we know these people's names, right? Who they were. But then also the only connection to them has been that horrific thing, right? Finding out who they are. Like, so if we do have their names, like, that's a way to connect with their history. So, this idea of wholly connecting folks, or not just having their only story being connected to something like that.
Just victimizes them again.
Exactly.
Well, one thing too, I think that I want people to understand is that they weren't forgotten by everybody. They were important to their families. Their families, when they were put into the ground, knew where they were, and visited them and maybe they had some kind of a marker, it didn't withstand time, or maybe the family couldn't afford it. But those people were very important at that moment. So it wasn't just like, oh, this is a mass grave and they were thrown in there and everyone forgot them the next day. No, we have forgotten them over the years and that information has been lost. But to those people at that moment, where they put their family, you know, maybe there were even groups of families. And so I think that's really important too, because sort of what's happened subsequently, obviously, they've sort of been erased. There's, you know, knowing where they are we don't know. But like, to certain families, they were there. And I know that that's part of the community engagement that we're trying to do, is get the names and get the oral histories that, yes, there are families who still know where, or that their people were buried there. But I think that should be a big emphasis too, because I think what Bernadette was saying, and it's one of the things that I think is really important, is every member, every person buried there was a person who built the community that we live in now.
Right.
And I think that it gets real easy with history to sort of focus on the famous people and to forget the people who were the milkmen and the school teachers and the bakers and the people who stayed home and took care of their kids, and even just the little kids who maybe didn't live for very long. All those people really are built the community we live in. And I think those stories are really important to tell, probably, in my view, more important than the famous people, because the famous people get talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And they also outnumber the, you know, recognized individuals by a long shot. So definitely the everyday stories are extremely important, because, you know, just like today, we're everyday people and each of us has a story. So these individuals also had stories. So, yeah.
I have so much going on in my mind right now. This is a really heavy topic. It really is. Oh my God.
You know, the research that could be conducted on the bodies from underneath the chapel reveal that they were of many races, many ethnicities. And so one of the things that I am concerned about is the name, what we're calling this, the historic colored grounds. I would prefer it to be called the community grounds, because it is composed of all kinds of people. And instead of focusing on the individuals that we don't know anything about, can we make this a story about what life was like as a normal person trying to build the community of Austin in the late 19th century?
I think that is pretty heavy. That's pretty heavy what you just dropped on us, Dr. Smith. And I'm gonna say that because you just said the normal person in the 19th century. I don't think life has ever been normal for my ancestors. I don't. For me, I am the recipient of a lot of things that I did not have to work for. And that's why I'm talking to you right now. So I think with that, I get where you're going. However, where I'm at, and just what you just said, why is Austin just now taking accountability for what has happened to Black people since the beginning of Austin's history? And I've been here since July 2018. And it just seems like it's just repetitive over and over and over. We're just gonna slap this together. And I'm not saying it about this project, I'm just speaking in general. We're gonna take this community, we're gonna give them a plaque, and we're gonna say this happened then, and then everything should be okay. I think the word colored, when I saw that, it struck a chord, but it makes sense because it's the truth. That's what they were called.
Right.
Why would we take that? I mean, it's like taking away, and as a historian, I'm not a proponent of knocking down monuments, because how can you tell that history in 100 years? I just have never understood why we have been doing that, but okay, be as it may. That's where Black people were called. I think it's probably a more proper word than what we were called before that.
Mm-hmm.
And even just the idea that, you know, from what they, especially obviously clearly in the South, just the grouping of people of color together and losing kind of the identities. And so we have these people that were buried, designated in this area for people of color. And it's not until we try to start doing genealogy that we actually find out if they're African American or Hispanic, Latino, Mexican, Tejano, potentially American Indian, Native American, or what. And so just the label that all of this stuff is lost, and, you know, we're essentially grouped together, and kind of what that actually did as far as kind of just the long-term effects of that. And, you know, I think I'm recent too. Like I got here in the beginning of 2019, you know, born and raised West Coast, from a pretty fortunate, educated family full of people of color. And so I came in with the perspective that, from, I guess, a natural curiosity of wanting to know more, because I think that was just naturally instilled in me by my parents or my grandparents, you know, to not just take things at the surface, you know, face value, to, you know, actually want to know the details, you know, to not just know that there's people here, but how many, you know, what were their names? And that was how the whole thing started. And so just, I think the outside perspective of me not being born and raised here, whether that's good or bad, but just an outside perspective that was needed to come in and to say, you know, why hasn't this been done? You know, and it's not unique to this one situation. You know, you talk about one of the surviving reminders of segregation in the country are cemeteries predominantly in the South. And so just wanting to come in and trying to understand more, wanting to know more, and trying to figure out, you know, there's definitely a story here. There's a lot of people here. And for me, it was that kind of decision to say, well, I don't necessarily want to wait for somebody else to, you know, tell the story or do this work, because what if it doesn't happen? You know, what if you need someone who is willing to do the work, as tedious as it might be? And so it was just kind of that call to action to want to be able to know more about these people, and want to be able to basically, trying to think of the word, feel like that was one thing that I owed, you know, the people that were there, or that the people that, you know, were not able to tell, you know, their stories. And as a descendant from, you know, people who do have a lot and do have markers, and understanding that while that legacy is great, there's other people here that deserve that same recognition, regardless of, you know, how much money they had or what education level they had. So I felt it was equally as important to do that, as well. So.
I've been thinking about this since Miss Kimberly first started, and I hope I don't ramble as I try to put together what I've been thinking in response to your various comments. I think we have to talk about why this area is called the Historic Colored Grounds. And we know about the systemic and institutional reasons why we don't know who were buried here, why the cemetery is segregated. We know that. I think it's number one, removing that name would be another form of erasure or covering up if we take away that name. So part of the narrative should be why that name is present. And then to kind of get it more broadly, Ms. Kimberly's comment about, you know, what the community wants, and which is what we are asking, is to think about why the community feels perhaps that they haven't been able to voice what they've wanted before, why they don't have a stake. And so to think about, you know, why we have this loss. And again, we know why there's the loss and the forgetting on an institutional level, but why has maybe the community forgotten, in a sense? Not that they have. And on certain levels, you have people moving away, people dying, so there's no longer family there. You have people moving away even in the 1870s, 1880s, as folks are getting buried as they're leaving Austin because the South is not where they want to be or need to be at that point. And so thinking about that, and for me personally, you know, on the one hand, on one side of my family, when I was little, like to get to this playground at the Catholic school, we would cross the cemetery and I would stop and visit my great aunt and uncle and some cousins that I knew were buried there before we hopped the fence and went play at the playground. But on the other hand, on my dad's side of the family, I knew nothing about my paternal great-grandfather. Supposedly he passed away when my grandfather was 2 years old or was a young boy. And in doing my own research, by virtue of what I've learned how to do as an architectural historian and historic preservationist, discovered that this man was alive as late as when my grandfather was a teenager, and he's buried in Beaumont, in my husband's hometown. And so I found a death certificate saying that he was buried in a historically Black cemetery. We go to this cemetery and there are what were obviously family plots that are completely grown over with like mature trees. And my great-grandfather is probably buried in one of the parts of that cemetery that I cannot access, even though I know he is there. And then just the state of many other tombstones. And this is an active cemetery, but somehow in the present, people have forgotten. And I think part of that forgetting in Oakwood Cemetery is also a component of not being welcome. And so in the forgetting, how can we also have interpretation programming that is welcoming? And I think people, even to a certain extent, before they can say what they want to see, what they want, is they have to feel welcome. And the reason that, I mean, this is what I do. This is, you know, how I get my you know, jollies, by going to these places, because I'm an architectural historian, but a cemetery is something that's part of a built environment, part of a cultural landscape. Sometimes I go to the cemetery to find stuff about builders and these people who I'm trying to find out who lived in these places that they built, which is how I found Thomas Hill's tombstone. And so there are just lots of levels of forgetting, but also being able to feel like you have access, whether it's to the archival records or the space of the cemetery itself, is really important. And I think that that should be one of the first sort of priorities or missions of this engagement as community stakeholders, and figuring out how we jump that hurdle in essence. I'm gonna be quiet.
I think it's important that, and this is going back to that initial question of whiting out the name colored. I think it's really essential that we use that word. And I'll go back to a personal experience that I had when I came to Austin at the Carver Museum. And in giving the history of the library museum, I always use the word colored. It was a colored library. And I was approached by a number of Blacks in the community who took offense to me using the word colored. And I had to explain to them the appropriate terms of that time was colored. And we have gone through a grand march of different names that have been given us. And I guess individuals go with what they're comfortable with in today's language, whether it is Black or whether it's African American, Afro-American. But at that particular time, it was colored. Reasons why I think need to be explained. But I think it is also vital that the story of individuals, whether known or unknown, we have to look at, and there is another group that's coming on board, is that family group. And that family group has many stories to be told. We as a people and I think we still do it, there's stories that we don't want to tell. There are secrets that we don't want to tell because we think it puts a bad name on us today individually. But we need to tell those stories. Like I said before, whether they are, famous or infamous, we need to tell the stories. And to get relatives and friends of relatives to share, and there's still people around that can share stories that have been carried on through their family history that will enlighten us, and that the committee may have already found out some of those stories. But the word, utilizing that word, and I don't know whether in the context of getting this grant, what was important that you use colored. And I still think it is important. It's vital to use that term.
Thank you, Ms. Bernadette, and thank you for everyone who opened up the conversation to the first question. And we're about 1 o'clock, and being from a qualitative research background and listening to stories, there's never enough time to hear the whole stories. And part of my role is going to be, and Jennifer, as you can see, just within 5 people who joined us today, there's so much to be captured for this project. But my role right now is to tell you guys, we're gonna move to the next question. And I also wanted to share, which I don't think we did at the beginning, as with every project, there's going to be a scope and a time and kind of what we're going to be covering for that project. But it looks like there's so much more that could be done. And Jennifer's trying to work on more funding to continue this conversation. We did invite for 5 focus group conversations. You probably saw this in what we sent out to you. So we are trying to capture the stories of descendants. We are also bringing on subject matter experts. So Dr. Dudley and Dr. Franklin and Deanna, we're going to be around some of the colleagues that work on some of this. So we are going to have a conversation for that. And then we're going to have 2 focus groups with NICs. So I always feel like we could have just spent time on just question number 1 on the how. But we do want to talk a little bit about and get your feedback while we have you here until 1:30 is, and I think we talked a little bit about the context of it, but I think I want to expand a little bit about the lens, because they are going to have to hone in for this project on the different lenses, and maybe it's all of them, and let's just have a conversation on that. And that was the question I asked: through what lens do we believe the story should be told? And that was community, city, and neighborhoods. But I also want to jump a little further in that, is there something else important that you believe we need to capture? So I'm going to kind of combine these two, given our time that we have left together today, and open it up again to just a discussion. And if you want to just keep talking about the same things and just do it naturally, then that's fine too. But I did want to make sure we touched on that. Stephanie, you're on mute. Can you?
And I had a whole speech I was saying. No, I just wanted to say that like I am feeling like this sense of anxiety, and it's because, you know, when you were talking about there's another group for descendants, like I very well could have, you know, ancestors buried here and I have no clue, you know, and this is a real issue, not just here. Like, you know, I spent a lot of time climbing into cemeteries, some in worse shape than others, connected to freedom colonies. And many times we don't know the names of who was there. You know, it's hard to find that. You know, a lot of them have been destroyed and pieces taken by folks. A lot of the descendants or people connected are no longer around. You know, in my family, and I go way back here, there are lots of people who we don't even know where they're buried. So I don't really know what the point to this, other than I just wanted to share that. Like, this is a real thing, a real issue.
Yeah, I echo that, because I'm thinking about my great-great-great-grandfather right now, who I'm still trying to find, Austin Sherrill. And half of the Sherrills were buried in Caldwell, and then half of them were buried in Austin. And I don't know, it's just, when you look at cemeteries, for me, and you ask the question about the lens, well, I'm always going to speak for the community first, because it's their narrative. But my issue is with the city. It's going to always go back to the city and taking accountability for this just happening. You know, like, why are we just paying homage to Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people? Black people, I'm just going to be built Austin, Texas. Why? It's just, I don't know. For me, it's just it's a repetitive thing, because this is not the first conversation I've been in about us, you know, capturing the narrative of Black people. So again, just going back to, you know, the name, those who don't have representation. If someone asked me to write a narrative today about my experience from July 18 to where I am now, looking at cemeteries and those who don't have representation, Kim, how would you go about that? What lens would you look through? That's how I'm viewing this right now in that question. So I don't have an answer. I only have more questions.
Well, the lens I would like to use is the lens of economic justice and poverty, and because the lens for this story is not an African-American lens. This is not just an African-American plot of land. We know from the DNA of the bodies exhumed underneath the chapel that there are all kinds of people here. It's not just an African-American story.
Okay, and Dr. Smith, right there, I have to say this. I'm Black. I'm not white. I'm not Hispanic, nor am I Asian. I'm speaking for me and my people. And the color that you see right now is brown. So I'm gonna bring it down some, Kim, bring it down. And say that again. I'm not speaking for people of color. I don't use those terms, because all people didn't go through the same things in these United States. Black people are still going through the same things. Hispanic people are still going through what they're going through, as well as Asian people. And I represent the Black community. So when I'm looking at this cemetery, I'm not concerned about them. I hope you contact them. I'm looking at Black people. What's wrong with that? My question to you, is that problematic that we're only speaking about Black people? Because that's what I identify with. The question.
I want this to be a story about all of Austin and the community that built Austin. That's who's buried here.
So when you say who built Austin, who built Austin?
Laborers. They could not afford a decent burial.
Okay.
I hear everything that's being said, and I think that that's possible by not changing color does not mean that we're not acknowledging all the different people that are buried here. And I think that speaks to how, they have been treated, right, as well. I think it speaks to all the things you're talking about around economics and all those things, that these folks were in some ways valued the same way that colored people were to be put in that, So I think there's a way to get to all of that. But I don't think it's by, changing the name, but it's by no means am I saying erase and don't acknowledge all the different people that are there, but maybe that can be the way that all these stories are being told as to how they all ended up there.
Exactly that. I think in cemetery staff, correct me if I'm wrong, was this an area that was designated by the city, this part of the cemetery for Black folk?
Yeah, designated as burial for people of color. And then you also have within the same area, you have a section that was also designated as, using the historic terminology, the stranger's ground. So visitors, people who died in Austin needed to be buried. So we have all of these kind of places that for a lot of reasons, we don't even know exactly where they are, except for the headstones that are still around. And so when we talk about, this part of the cemetery, like behind the chapel, there's headstones from people who, were European descent. So they were clearly part of this strangers grounds section. And then obviously when you do look at the chapel bioarchaeology report, you do have a pretty good mixture. But if you look at the overall picture as far as like records for people designated as being buried in the historic colored grounds, you have roughly 2,700 or so. And so that could be, African Americans, Hispanic people, Mexican, Latino, Tejano, potentially American Indian, Native American. You're not going to know that until you start plugging those names into Ancestry and start trying to do the genealogy. As far as the strangers grounds, because when I went through the whole database, I did everybody who had a unique section identifier, I pulled them out. So I didn't just pull everybody out that was designated as being buried in the section for people of color. Everybody who had any kind of interesting identifier, so that was, for the historic colored grounds, the strangers grounds, there's records that, have the terminology new cemeteries. So there was, basically new grounds. So anybody who had any kind of interesting, unique identifier, I pulled them out. And so you have 2,700 or so for people being designated in the space, the area for people of color. You have roughly, I think, 800 or 900 for people who were designated as being buried in the space for strangers, which could also serve as overlap for that area. So even if you have equal amounts of different people as far as the chapel burials are concerned, when you start looking at the overall numbers, you have 2,700 people who were designated as people of color, 800 or 900 or so that are strangers or people who were visiting and died in Austin and needed to be buried. And so, but I also wanted to touch on this idea that as we try to talk about Black stories and the Black voice, because as we start going through the genealogy of those 2,700 people and whatever we're able to find, like through ancestry or what, could very well predominantly mostly be African Americans. And so I think it's important to talk about, when we start talking about the Black voice and those Black stories, for whatever reason, it comes to get kind of overshadowed by the threat that we're not going to talk about anybody else. And I think that's an important thing about history, that as we try telling our stories, it's then pushed like we don't want to tell anybody else's stories. And so even acknowledging that notion is important, because that's what we're going through right now in this country. And I think there's this idea that by telling our stories, we're not going to be able to, or we don't care about the stories of other people, or in the same way that our stories weren't cared about for generations and generations. And so, so I just think it brings up just an interesting point of history and what's going on right now.
And
I,
that's
in
my
no
point
way,
for asking that question, because you have a space that was designated for Black folk, but even in death, they didn't get that space. Just like they didn't get their space, their due in the community of Austin, because you get a cemetery that's propped down over people. You have other folk who are buried there, but whether they're strangers or Hispanic, poor people of whatever race, you're basically being relegated to the status of being Black.
Right.
That's why they put you there.
Yeah.
And that's why maintaining this as a history of the historic colored grounds is important, even though we do need to talk about an entire context and those demographics, because I'm interested in the specifics. I'd like to see some panels or whatever with little pie charts showing how many Black people, how many white people, how many Hispanic people, how many doctors, how many teachers, how many, professions, and that, so that is one way to identify all of these individuals. But we cannot forget or have the fact that this was and is the historic colored grounds overshadowed in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because I think, to me, that area is the people that the community at that time designated as others, right? So it is the people that they decided were not as valuable as other people for whatever reason, because they were poor, because we didn't know who they were, because of the color of their skin, because, whatever reason, but it's the people that at the time, the community of Austin said were not as valuable as other people. And I think that's an important thing to talk about. And how you talk about it is like these people got relegated to the status of being Black because they weren't viewed as important. And I think that is that's the way I think that it should be talked about, that you include those other people as somehow something about their lives was deemed not important and somehow they got downgraded.
well, I think all I just wanted to chime in and say was that I wasn't trying to say that I'm not concerned about other people, because I'm a historian. I'm concerned about everyone, but I am concerned about Black people first, because that is what I am. And I think that's fair for my life and for my ancestors. Like, why would I forget them? Why? That's the reason why you asked me to come. You didn't ask me to come speak about Hispanic people, though I have Hispanic people in my family. Half of my family is Latino. but I'm not here to speak about them. And I think that's fair. You know, when you see colored, that was not the first thing that came to my mind was Asian people. I have to be fair to myself in reading that. I'm a historian. This is real. I read books. I do oral histories. I've talked to Black people, Hispanic people, and Asian people in this community. That wasn't the first thing that came to my mind. It went right back to Black people. So in saying that, I think that, you know, again, and I think it's been agreed upon, if that's taken out, it erases a whole demographic of history in which those people were called colored every day. And remember, before colored, that was another term. And before that term, there was another term. And I think, I think this is good conversation. People are looking serious, but, this is what history is, and it's not always, we're not always going to agree. I will just drop this in. This is what Dr. King says today. We must accept finite disappointments, but never lose infinite hope. I think that's what we're doing today.
And I
These are
think
like
that,
go ahead.
I think that one of the important things for us to remember is that we are an inclusive people. And to tell my story and someone else's story, people who are sitting on the panel, if we're telling the full story, we do include others. But that does not discount, we're still called colored.
Well, I
Okay.
know we have about a few minutes here. It's about 1:25. And I want to thank you for your vulnerability and for your honesty. And we could probably continue this conversation for many hours. And we do have to put some time on it based on what, but I do want to give at least 5 minutes if there's anything else that wants to be added or shared. And then we'll close this up here today.
I'd like to say the invitation for oral histories isn't just for known descendants. So if you would like to schedule time to come in and have us talk to you about your story and record it for the project and for posterity, that would be very welcome.
Thank you.
Unless, can I just ask a question then, folks, because there are a couple of concerns that were raised by that I just want to see if we can, might get some answers to. So one was, I know Ms. Keaton was concerned that how do you represent people who are unnamed, right? Like and then how do you get descendants? If this, the descendants of the folks who are buried at the historic colored grounds, because we don't know who they are. I think for this project, we've been defining descendants more broadly. I mean, we do so in archaeology. We don't consider descendants who are just lineal descendants of people who are buried at the cemetery. So we do have one here. I mean, Greg is a lineal descendant. He's got ancestors buried there. But I also consider, like Stephanie, who I know is basically born and raised in East Austin. So she's also a member of that descendant community. And so is it problematic to kind of broaden that out? I mean, I think obviously this is not a wholly inclusive. We would love to grow the list of descendants, but we also want to make sure that those folks are represented in what the project is trying to achieve. How else can we do it? And who are we missing? And what else do we need to be thinking about when we try to say that we are trying to reach out to descendants?
I think Stephanie Lane can answer that question perfectly.
I also have the same question. I think that was framed great. Yeah, how do we know who are the descendants? We don't know who. I guess it's where right now, is it just folks that are descendants of other parts of Oakwood? Because we don't really know, right?
The
The other
3D
people.
modeling project will be for this particular section of the cemetery.
Right. So are there many? I mean, are there folks who have come up and said, yes, I'm a descendant of people? Oh, great. Okay. Wow.
Including someone from whose great uncle was one of the paupers buried here,
Mm,
including some Tejanos who are buried here.
mm,
Because we don't have a map, we do have some headstones.
got you.
It's really an interesting mix. And even if you could now afford to put a headstone on the grave of your ancestor, where would you put it?
Yeah.
Which is
You
why
know,
we're doing this
some-
digitally.
You know,
Mm,
some of the descendants can be knowledgeable, but also persons who were part of the community or next door neighbors, people who knew them. You know, there's some, we could say some of our best friends know us better than maybe our sister or brother, and can tell or add to the story. So asking the descendants who they knew, or maybe they can refer us to someone in the family. And I know this, you know, a lot of them aren't here, but could they refer us to people who may know that family history?
That's an excellent suggestion to add onto the oral, at the end of the oral history questions. Is there other people that we should contact and talk to? Absolutely.
Right.
yeah.
Thank you.
I wonder
See,
if
I
there's
think a
also,
lot of people are descendants, because to me, it's like descendants are, do you have a shared, do you see this burial ground as part of your heritage?
Mhm.
Do you have, you know, connections in that sense, right? Being a
A
Black
bloodline.
person, you know, I'm not from Austin, I'm not even from Texas, but, you know, in a sense, I mean, I wouldn't claim the kind of descendancy that like Greg does, for example, but I would say that this is part of my heritage, part of what, you know, that I have a stake in this history. I'm invested in it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
not that I'm not including myself as someone who should be guiding the research, you know, like the scope, the questions and so forth, because that's why we have you all here,
Mhm.
inviting, you know, people who are various stakeholders in the community and descendants. But I certainly see myself as invested.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, yeah, the question about the descendants, asking them who they know, and even further, like which freedom colony or which settlement were you from? You know, were you from, like there was a large settlement of Mexican Americans around, what is the area, the square, right? That was a settlement there. And so it's interesting if we can find out, like, oh yeah, my family was from, you know, this community, then that would maybe, okay, then maybe we can figure that all these folks were buried in that area. Because as I've done work around a lot of these communities, it's like there are no burial grounds on this land. And some of the people, like we find them in Evergreen or Bethany, but there's a large groups of people that are missing. And it makes you wonder if that is directly where a lot of these folks are.
I'm sure you all have probably searched out in some of these smaller churches around Austin and just beyond, they have their own cemeteries. And some asking the question of some of these small churches, I don't know if you've done this already, like a Elgin or a Lockhart, or and the church grounds had cemeteries, and some of their lineage may know, and maybe relative, maybe descendants, but also maybe know of people who know them.
Very good. So one of the things I like to do when we close conversations like this is, we've moved emotions, we've moved thoughts and feelings about things, and we traditionally like to just have you close your screen and have a little bit of peace in closing out this conversation that you've been on for about an hour and a half. So we allow you to log off when you're ready, and not necessarily say this ends, but just when you feel closure and peace with this conversation, and you close your mind and your heart to be able to step away. So feel free to close your screen, and then when you're ready, feel free to log off. Thank you very much for your time today.